Thank you again for giving us your word, for loving us enough to communicate who you are and what you expect from us, and then sending your spirit to encourage and instruct us in it. As we look at it tonight, encourage us to stay faithful to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we're looking at the last few verses of Hebrews chapter 10. Before we actually get to there, however, let's just review and make a note that in the verses immediately preceding this, Hebrews 10, 26 to 31, the writer uh, presented a strong, very, very strong warning against deliberately sinning and saying to them, this would be utter foolishness to return to the sacrifices of the temple because they're obsolete. They're no longer any good. And if you turn back to them and reject the provision of Jesus, you've in essence rejected the only way that you can have your sins forgiven. In these verses 10, 32 to 39, the writer is presenting encouragement following the warning things. We used to say in administration, you always put everything in what we call the sandwich. You have something good, then you have the problem you have to face, and then you end up with something positive so that they go away knowing something's got to change, but it's not the end of the world. We get the impression here that the writer was saying, you know what? There is really some great danger in turning away from your faith. And if you do, the implications of that are just beyond imagination. You don't even want to think about what would happen if you turn away from it. But he's saying, I don't think that's what you're going to be doing based on your previous commitment to faith in view of the persecutions you faced early on. I have confidence that you're going to face these new challenges with the same amount of faith. It's a positive. God's going to give you the strength you need. Artie, let's begin with 1032.
Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you stood your ground in great contest in the face of suffering.
Remember, this is more than just, hey, just kind of think back briefly to what has happened. The idea, the word that's used here is more than simply recall, but really focus on this. Mull it over and over again in your mind. The writer wants them to think about their past experiences and realize that becomes a pattern for the present situation that they find themselves in. Past conduct impacting present conduct. They were obviously facing significant persecution, and the writer wanted them to think back to the early days in their faith when they also faced severe persecution, and they were faithful then. And what he's saying in essence is that should be an example of how you are to live today. In remembering how they had faced that persecution, I think the writer had at least two things in mind. I think he was hoping to remind them that they can have confidence in God's ability to bring them through. They'd been through some tough times. God had been with them. He'd strengthened them. And if they were successful in the past, then they have reason to assume that the God who never changes will be with them and they can do it again. And the second thing I think he probably wants them to keep in mind is think about all you gave up and what it cost you to stay firm to the Lord when you first made those decisions for him. And think about what it would mean if you now turn your back on that. You will have wasted those experiences. You can't do that and expect God to continue to bless them. You have a quote in your handout from John Calvin and his commentary, and basically saying, you know what, you began well, don't back off at this point. Don't go backwards, go forward in what you're doing with it. And God has done glorious things for you in the past, and you can be assured He will in the future. He, the writer quotes a passage, makes reference to a passage from Deuteronomy, and that passage has already been quoted by him in the earlier chapters and earlier verses, and there was a reference to remembering the old days, and we wonder if maybe that isn't what he had in mind here. Remember the old days. From Deuteronomy 32:7 with it. There's a difference, however, a rather interesting difference. When the writer of Deuteronomy, Moses, wrote this, he was saying, look back on what God has done for you. Remember the faithfulness of God in the past. Here, he's not saying remember God's faithfulness as much as remember how you were faithful. Remember how you stood the test and was there. The writer of Hebrews, unfortunately, doesn't give us the details we'd like to have as to what was going on in the life of the church at this point, or for that matter, what they had suffered in the past. The indication is that it was a fair amount of time before this was being written to them, perhaps as much as 10 years earlier. And being the kind of person I am, and probably all of you, it's like, what did they go through? What did they face? Who was there? And so forth with it. The church, historically, the early church suffered innumerable occasions of persecution. So it could have been any one of the many events that were there. The key is that in light of what they had done and the way they had faced those difficult times and stood firm, now they can stand firm facing the same kind of thing again. And they had willingly paid the price for their faith. Don't give up on it. You can continue to do it. He says in that verse that they endured great contests, literally great struggles, and they had done so and stood their ground. They had remained faithful. That word for contest is an interesting one. It's the one for which we get our word athletics. And I think, if you picture this, he's saying, how it is in an athletic contest. You struggle with it. It's a tough one. You don't give up, because the Cowboys did, but that was okay on it. Didn't turn off. They wanted me to answer on it. And
I tried.
Actually, it's kind of like an obstacle race, and you've run that race and you've been faithful with it. We know that severe persecution broke out at least twice in the early church in 49 AD under Emperor Claudius, and again in 64 AD under Emperor Nero. Probably, if it's referring to either one of those, it would have been the fact that it was Claudius, because Nero was probably too close to where he was at this point. Although, again, we have no way of knowing if it was that or one of the many minor I use that word sparingly, minor persecution. When you're going through them, there's no such thing as minor persecution. And whatever it was significant. And he says, they did that after they had received the light. That same terminology was used by the writer in chapter 6, and there he was encouraging them also. And the idea of being enlightened literally means after your conversion, or he could have written because of you were converted, because of your conversion. The idea of receiving light has the idea of the light of God coming into our lives. Some of us received that light pretty early in life, and others, they were much older before that light suddenly dawned on them. He said, you faced a lot of challenges when you first became a Christian, and you were faithful to it. Don't lose sight of that now.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do something slightly different right now. Mom, I'm going to have you read two verses instead of one. So
Okay.
usually we just read one and then we talk about it, but let's read Hebrews 10:33 and 34.
Okay. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult, literally reproach, and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions.
So the writer is looking back at some of the conflict, some of the persecution that the his listeners have faced over who knows how many years and who knows how many years ago. And he's reminding them that they've already been through a lot of this. They haven't given up yet, and they shouldn't give up now. The writer of Hebrews spells out in these two verses quite a few of the different types of persecution, types of suffering that they faced. And he seems to indicate that some of it happened to them, some of it happened to their neighbors, to their friends, to their family members. So some of it was personal, happening themselves. Some of it was, I want to say, persecution through association. I'm not in prison, but my neighbor, my friend is in prison, and I have sympathy with him. And so I suffer because he's suffering, kind of thing. The suffered, it says a number of things. Number one, they suffered reproach or insult because of their faith. And this seems to have been some kind of a verbal persecution, mocking, making fun of, being held up and ridiculed. Interestingly, that word publicly exposed, we get our English word theater from it. So it kind of carries this idea of being out there publicly, put up on, even maybe on stage and made fun of. We think so oftentimes of even our modern day comics. If have ever seen a comedy show or something, and the person stands up in stage and just makes fun of everyone and mocks everyone. That's kind of what's going on, only they're being mocked for their faith, publicly disgraced, made a spectacle in public. That's the first thing he says. He says they lost their possessions. They were persecuted through the loss of possessions. What exactly those possessions were, we don't know. In a lot of instances, even today, persecution, a loss of possessions is you might lose your job because you're a Christian. You might lose in certain countries, kicked out of your house and not allowed to do things. It could be something along that line. Interestingly, in this passage, the writer of Hebrews does not mention anything about martyrdom, death. And so, as Dad was talking a little earlier about persecution under Claudius or Nero, we know that Emperor Nero ordered the execution of a lot of Christians. And so some have suggested that it's probably not Nero's persecution, whether it was persecution under Claudius or just general persecution that happens against Christians, we don't know. But we do know that at some point property goods was taken from them. We do know that at certain times that the Romans kicked all of the Jews and as a result all of the Christians out of certain cities. We know Priscilla and Aquila were in Rome and then they got booted out of Rome because they were Christians, they were Jewish Christians, and they moved to Corinth, and that's where they met Paul. And so they probably lost a lot of their possessions there in Rome. That persecution continued on, and I'm sure that some of the Jewish leadership also was trying to persecute Christians who were coming in and claiming Jesus as Messiah, and so probably were not too happy with the way Christians were spreading the gospel and wanted them gone out of even the Jewish community and were booting them out. And so the Christians probably lost some possessions there. That's kind of the personal persecution that's mentioned here. But then there's also some corporate persecution or persecution by association. He says that you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You stood side by side beside those who were suffering. You understood their suffering and therefore you shared in it. Presumably, the suffering by others was probably greater than what they personally experienced. That's often the case, that what's happened is I see some really horrible persecution and it makes me feel bad, and I suffer along with whoever's being persecuted. My suffering isn't quite as bad as what they're going through, but I make that emotional connection. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying here. In some way, they associate themselves with the situation of the persecuted people, even if they're not directly involved with it personally. They know it's my coworker, my parents, or some tie-in like that. He talks there in the beginning of verse 34. You suffered, and implies they had sympathy. You suffered with those in prison. There's sympathy there. That's what the Greek word, we get our Greek word sympathy from there. You suffered with those in prison. You sympathize with them. You understand what they're going through. We know from what we read in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul, just about every time he went anywhere, he got thrown in prison. Might have been more Paul's problem than anyone else's, but if you remember our discussions of the book of Acts recently, but persecution and being thrown in prison was something that was fairly common, it seems anyway, for in the first century, for those that chose to follow Jesus rather than follow Caesar. We're not told how they sympathized with the people that were in prison, but it appears that in some way they were allowed to share and assist in that imprisonment. If you remember in the scripture in the Bible, there's a story in the book of Acts of Peter who gets thrown into prison, and the Christians around decide they sympathize with him, and so they gather together in a house and they start to pray, and they pray for his release. That's the important part. The unimportant part of the story is when he gets out of prison, he goes and knocks on the door, and the servant girl leaves him sitting out in the street instead of letting him into the house and hiding him from the Romans. But the point is that the women were sympathizing with him. They were assisting and sharing in his imprisonment. We know that when Paul was in chains in Rome, he had a lot of people coming and helping him, And I think we mentioned at one point, I don't remember if this was in Bible study or if this was in one of my sermons, that the Timothy, bring my jacket. That doesn't seem, Timothy was able to come and help Paul and then be part of Paul's imprisonment. There were people that brought Paul food and things like that. It made it seem as if they were actually there in prison with him. In Hebrews chapter 6, verse 10, the writer had said that God would not forget the works of love shown to those who were in need. And this seems to be an example of that when someone is being persecuted and thrown in prison, you sympathize with them, you empathize with them, you go in and you help them out and you provide whatever they need. And I think probably if we go back to Jesus' teaching, I think this is exactly what he says when he was talking in Matthew 25. And Mom, I'm going to have you read Matthew 25, 35 to 40, because it's such a great passage. Mom?
For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.
Make a note that one of the things Jesus failed to say is, when I was a stranger, you deported me.
Yeah, well, to talk a little bit, I need to talk a little bit about prisons just real quick. Prisons today in our Western society are vastly different than prisons during the Roman time. And we always hear today, I always hear on the news, when it starts to get cold outside, that someone, a street bum, will go and rob a store and then stand there and wait for the police to come and arrest him. Why does he do that? Because he knows he's going to go to prison. And in prison, he's going to get a bed and he's going to get heat and he's going to get a roof over his head and he's going to get 3 square meals a day. And he's going to be taken care of when he can't take care of himself out on the street when it gets cold or something like that. Prisons in Roman society in Roman times was quite a bit different. The Roman government would put you into jail and then leave you there. They did not provide anything for you. If you wanted a meal, you had to have someone come and give you a meal. You had to have your family or your friends provide you with food, with clothing, and things like that. When we talk about going to visit prisoners now, Jesus says, you came and visited me. If I go, and Dad used to do some prison ministry for a while, and he would go and visit, but he would just go and visit and he'd talk, and he's not allowed to bring anything. He's not allowed to slip a file into a cake or anything like that. But it was, yeah, John, it's not just a social thing. This is a requirement for survival. If you wanted to live, you had to have someone come and feed you. Interestingly, in many countries, in Kenya, hospitals, a lot of the hospitals run the same way. If you're not in one of the private wards, if you're in a public ward in the hospital in Kenya, you better hope you have family that's going to bring you food for your meals, because otherwise you go hungry. The hospital doesn't provide you food, and neither did prisons in ancient Rome. And so one of the reasons why Paul had all these people coming and going, and we're thinking, well, why is he allowed all that access? Why is he allowed to talk to people and to have Timothy come and bring him his jacket and have all these people join him in prison? Well, because without it, he'd be dead. And the Romans didn't like dead prisoners. They kind of wanted people to take care of them, so that they didn't have to. It's cheaper to get someone else to take care of them than it is to bury a dead body. So that's kind of what's going on here. That as part of this prison, if we're really going to empathize, if we're really going to sympathize with those who are suffering, we need to be involved in them, more than just Sunday morning praying for all the prisoners in the world, but get involved and see what we can be part of that, because that's what is being talked about here. And when the writer of Hebrews says you sympathize with these prisoners, that's what's going on. He talks also in here about joyfully accepting the confiscation of your property, which I think is just amazing. You've gotten this, whatever, your land, your house, your car. Well, I guess back then it wouldn't be a car, but your chariot, whatever they had, and it's confiscated. And what's your response? Rah, 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 rah. I can't stand the IRS. They took my money from me. And then the writer of Hebrews says you've joyfully accepted the confiscation of the property. Again, specific details are missing on what was taken, when it was taken, who it was taken from, where it went, anything like that. But it seems fairly obvious that an individual's or government officials, maybe even religious leaders, have taken person's property without allowing for any way of getting that back. And the courts are not going to kind of help you out. You've lost the property, it's been taken and it's gone. And again, the emphasis that the writer of Hebrews is bringing is not to tell us all these details that we'd like to know. Oh, he got his $1 million mansion taken. Well, whatever. It's not on the details of the loss, but on the attitude of those who suffered such. They were joyful, joyful that they were considered worthy to suffer for the sake of the gospel. And it seems a strange way to react to loss. But when you have that inner strength from God, and that it gives you that joy in the midst of what the world might normally have crumbled under. And why are you not worried about losing possessions? Because the whole theme of the book of Hebrews has been better. And so the writer of Hebrews says, you know that you yourselves have better and lasting possessions. Our strength in when we lose something in times of loss is found in viewing life and possessions in terms of eternity. We all know people that have suffered loss. Their house has burned down or something like that, and the response is oh, if they're Christians, oftentimes the response is not, oh, I lost everything. It's, well, they're just possessions. They can be replaced. Yeah, maybe not all of the possessions, not all of the pictures and that stuff can be replaced, but they're just things. And we have stored up for us treasure in heaven, where rust and moth, or rust and moth and rust cannot get it. We can accept the truth that what awaits us when we get to heaven is far superior to anything we may lose here on earth. And I think that it's in there. I just like the way the writer of Hebrews says that. They knew that you yourselves had, that word for knowing describes certainty. You yourselves, he's double emphasizing that. They were personal possessors of those heavenly realities. And when we get to it, after Thanksgiving, Hebrews chapter 11, parts of Hebrews chapter 12, parts of Hebrews chapter 13. We're going to look at some of those lasting possessions that Christians have. That word lasting that's in there, a better and lasting possession, carries the idea of something that cannot be destroyed. We're reminded of Jesus when he speaks. Here you go, Ma. You can go ahead and read it. Should have been paying attention.
Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal.
Man, I had this great idea, but someone had it before me. The reality of the unseen or eternal is more real than the reality of the present. And that's just a fact. The challenge for us is now to live in the light of eternity, and not in the light of our present, in the problems of our present age. Matthew, in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus declares we're blessed when we're persecuted, and when false lies are told about us, because our reward is great in heaven. Matthew chapter 5, in verse 10, Jesus speaks of the blessings to come for those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And I think that's important distinction to make. The persecution because you are a Christian. There are some people that are persecuted because they're jerks.
Stupid.
That's not, that's not the persecution we're talking about, okay? We're talking about being persecuted because of your faith, because you're standing up for what you believe in. And that's what we're talking about, for righteousness sake. Luke chapter 6, Jesus tells his disciples that they are blessed when they're hated and reproached for the sake of the Son of Man, because they can rejoice in the fact that they would have a great reward in the future. Mom, I am going to let you say this one before I say it. Mom. Luke chapter 6, 22.
Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and assault you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man.
And again, you're blessed when you get persecuted because of Jesus. And I think one of the messages of yes, they do, John. One of the messages in the New Testament is that Jesus was persecuted. We're going to be persecuted, but even Jesus shares in our persecution that comes our way. Paul writes this when he writes to the Romans in Romans 15:3.
For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me.
And so when people insult us because we're a Christian, we can rest assured that Jesus is standing there right next to us, taking those insults on himself as well. And we're not in this alone. We're not being persecuted alone. We're persecuted for the sake of the gospel. And Jesus understands that, and he empathizes and sympathizes with us, and he's right there with us. And I think one of the real challenges that particularly the American church faces, is that the American church has not suffered very much in recent years. Now, you will have a lot of people who will say, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? Well, yes, there has been some suffering, But I've got friends in Sudan who who have suffered so much more. And I have friends in North Africa who are suffering because of the sake of the gospel. And the American church being told that you say a happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas. That's not suffering. That's just not suffering, okay? And I think we've got to be careful that, and I think it would be very helpful uh, if we, as a church, American church, we need to be more involved with the church around the world, and so that we can feel their suffering and empathize with them and go in and help them out as much as we can. And in that sense, suffer right along with them, since we are very blessed in this country to not suffer under the persecution that so many of our fellow Christians, Christian brothers and sisters are.
On Saturday, Artie and I were at a luncheon, and one of our EC missionaries, Julie Shirk, was there, and she spent some time in Haiti and was talking about some of the people she knew and the suffering they were undergoing in Haiti. And you could just see her heart breaking for those people. And that's what we need to understand. And joyful when it costs us something. I was robbed several times in Kenya, and I must admit, it was not joyful. It was that feeling of I've been violated. And the worst one was when took the boys' cassette player, and they took it out of the car, and the cassette player was worth about $3. But the window they broke to get it out of the car was a lot more than that. And it's hard because things that we hold on to are precious to us, and yet we need to keep in mind the eternal dimension and store up things in heaven. Marty, you got 1035.
So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded.
Remember what you've done in the past, the boldness with which you faced early difficulties and losses, and you're going to be rewarded for that. And it's a personal challenge to them to carry on. And that word throw away is a rather interesting one. It was used to describe literally throwing away trash. So the writer is literally saying, don't regard your confidence in God as something be just simply trash and tossing it out with the garbage. We toss away. No, let me back that one up. My wife tosses away. I keep anything that we're not using. And we are supposed to toss away our faith accordingly. Artie, 1036.
You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised.
Need to persevere. In verse 32, they were praised for standing firm in the face of difficult situations. Now they're called on to do it again. Stand firm, persevere, don't give up. You've seen what happens when you can stand firm and how God blesses you. And the idea of perseverance is a word that really means stand true under severe persecution, severe pressure, severe difficulties with it. It's persistence, even when the circumstances around us would indicate that maybe we ought not to worry about it, ought not to be calm on it. Revelation 2:10 is an interesting verse, and there it's talking about Jesus, or Jesus is saying Christians are to be faithful even unto death, and they can do that knowing that Jesus will raise them up at the last day. The reason they're to remain faithful, even if it results in death, is that it's the will of God. Now, that sounds a little strange because I don't see the will of God doing anything but enriching me. But the truth of the matter is, His will is that we remain firm in the face of whatever comes our way. And He wants us to make sure we do that. For Jesus, the will of God was a cross. I don't know what it is for each of us individually, but we are to stand firm regardless of the cost of that. And then he says, you will receive what he has promised. But I wish he had two more papyrus sheets so he could have spelled that one out. He doesn't detail the exact things that we can know have been promised to us. But in light of what he's just finished saying, we do know that what's been promised is better and lasting. So we can rest assured on that. And the idea is that believers who remain faithful, even when it's tough to be that way, receive a rich reward. And we can count on that reward because he has promised. And if God has promised, we can depend on it. He never fails. In the next 2 or 3 chapters that we'll get to in December, January, and probably into May, we're going to see some of those lasting possessions that saints of old got because they remained faithful. And it wasn't just for them, it's for us also. Artie, verse 37.
For in just a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay.
Verses 37 and then verse 38 are actually a combination of a couple of Old Testament texts from Isaiah and Habakkuk. And he's quoting them from the Greek translation, the Septuagint translation. In Isaiah, it is the Lord who says he's coming to judge. And in Hebrews, that is spelled out in terms of Jesus and his return. And when he comes, he's going to set things straight. This is kind of like, wait till dad gets home. Wait till Jesus comes back. It's going to be made right at that point. The passage in Habakkuk.
You got to turn your phone off or something. Cause...
Yeah. The passage in Habakkuk is a very interesting one. That whole book is an one. Maybe I can get Dan to preach on it sometime.
Sure.
He's looking around. Nothing is going right for the Israelites. And he says, when are you going to do something? And God says, hey, guess what? I'm sending some other guys over to punish you. And Habakkuk says, what? And he says, but hey, in the end, I'm going to make everything right with it. The writer here adjusts this a little bit. He adds a definite article. So we know he's talking about the Messiah coming back. And I suspect that everybody in the early church knew of Jesus' prediction of persecution that was coming. He details this for them. And this was this is going to come. But, and it was a huge but, Jesus is coming back again. The return is there. He who is coming refers to the Lord who is coming again. And some days I say, even so, come quickly. Yeah. And every now and then he says, yes, but he's patient because he's not willing that any should perish.
Hebrews 10:38, Mom.
But my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back.
This one's a little scary because the writer of Hebrews uses here a phrase, my righteous one, that is kind of reserved for the Messiah, the righteous one, but he changes it now and he's applying that now to all believers in general. And so my righteous one has a wider implication. It's not just the Messiah sent by God, but it's all who are redeemed because of the superior sacrifice of Jesus. Paul actually, in his letter to both the Romans and to the Galatians, uses these same verses from Habakkuk that Dad mentioned. They're from Isaiah and Habakkuk. Paul uses them in Romans 1 and Galatians 3 in a slightly different way. Paul uses these passages to talk about salvation through faith and not through works, whereas the writer here is not really talking about redemption, but he's talking about faithful living. You're going to live faithfully once you have been redeemed. And so that's where this kind of ties in, righteous one living by faith. That word faith can be understood in both ways, either the faith of coming to know Jesus and the faith it takes to live a life as God asks us to live. It's legitimate to use that either way. And the overall message is that while we are saved by faith, the Christian life is also to be lived by faith. And that's so very important. There are a few ancient manuscripts, a few old copies of this particular book of Hebrews. Now you have to remember we don't have any of what we call the original autographs, the actual letter that was written. We have copy of 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 copy. And some of the older, more we usually say the older the translation or is the copy it is, the more accurate it is. Remember, they copied everything by hand. They didn't slap it on a photocopier and they're exactly the same. No, they hand copied them, and every once in a while, one of the scribes would like doze off a little bit and make an extra letter or an extra word or something in there, and so now we've got two copies of the book of Hebrews, and one of them has this word in it, one of them doesn't, and that biblical scholars go, woohoo, this is going to be fun. We're going to be arguing about this for thousands of years of what's going on. And in here, the some of the more ancient manuscripts have a reading in here instead of just saying the righteous will live by faith, it actually says the righteous will live by my faith. And that causes some problems because but not really if you think about it, because it's my faith in God by which I am living. It's not my faith. It's faith in God that saves me. It's my faith in Him, but it's belief in Him. And so I don't think it really makes a difference if you have the word my faith in there or just faith in general. I think they're both talking about the same thing. Um, the writer of Hebrews then says, I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. Or the King James Version, and if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. The writer has already kind of alluded to the seriousness of falling under the displeasure of God, and that seems to be carried over to this statement. God's displeasure in it brings loss of fellowship along with his wrath and judgment. And when we choose to go away from the faith, as some of the people in the right in Hebrews that the writer of Hebrews is writing to were thinking about. We know this is not going to be a good thing, and God is sad when we decide we've had enough and walk away. And we've already seen throughout this book that there will be wrath and judgment for those who are outside of that faith. Mom, Hebrews 10:39. I think this is the last verse of the day, and I hope so because it said
chapter 10.
chapter. Sorry, yeah, chapter 10:39.
But we are not of those who shrink back and are
Yeah.
destroyed, but we are of those who believe and are saved.
Yeah. And so as the writer of Hebrews did in chapter 6, he assumes the best of his readers and states that he is sure that they are going to be faithful. If he shrinks back, I'll not be pleased with him, but we are not those who shrink back. You can almost see him standing up there leading the cheer on. Are we going to do it? No, we're not. We'll stand firm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great little pre-game talk, a war, kind of build you up, makes you want to go, okay, we're those
That's
who
right.
believe and are saved. And he includes himself. He says, we're the ones that are doing it. It's not you're gonna be okay. It's like we're going to be okay. And I think this verse is really a direct application of what this passage from Habakkuk was all about that he just quoted. He uses many of the same words as Habakkuk does to drive home his confidence in the readers. And the point is that true faith will result in faithfulness, and that will result in blessings from God. Maybe not here on earth. Here on earth, we're going to have persecution, we're going to have loss, but at least in eternity, we will receive blessings from God, if not in the present life. This passage kind of closes with this word of optimism. The author has included himself and these first readers. When we come back after Thanksgiving, we're going to get into Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith, and all of the Old Testament people who have stood firm and received God's blessings. Maybe not when they were here on earth, because the writer of Hebrews is going to talk about people who were cut in half. And I don't see that particularly as something that I'm looking forward to. But the writer of Hebrews says, yeah, but they held firm. Edward Fudge, in his commentary, and I believe this is in your handout, he writes, "We are not of that class who draws back and end in perdition or destruction, but of those who believe and keep on believing to the resultant saving of our soul." And then Albert Mohler, and I think this is also in your handout, wraps up the chapter of Hebrews, his commentary on this chapter of Hebrews. And he says, these warning passages keep the believer from spiritual complacency. Before learning from and appreciating the faithful example the authors identifies in Hebrews 11, we'll talk about those after Thanksgiving, these believers must be reminded to persevere in the faith. Before they can associate themselves with those listed in the following chapters, they must make every effort not to draw away from Christ. It's with this final warning that the author reminds all believers to hold true to the faith and thus to associate with saints throughout the centuries. And he's going to list a whole bunch of them from the Old Testament in the next chapter.